Read you a story about a couple that I call John and Misty, and this is a real marriage case. And then what I'd like to do is talk to you about what happens when, before we even get into the outline, after I read you this story, I'd like to get into the outline. But before getting into the outline, talk to you about what happens if people don't have conflict resolution procedures. What happens, what could potentially happen in a marriage, what could happen in relationships if you don't have a way to work through what I would say are inevitable conflicts. Would you agree with that? We live on a fallen planet with other fallen people. There is no such thing as relationships that don't have tensions. So if you're living in a fantasy world where you think you can go through life with no conflict, and the way you deal with conflict is you pretend, you just kind of ignore it and wishes maybe go take a nap, and when you wake up, maybe it'll be gone. Well, it's still there when you wake up. So we all have to learn how to deal with conflict because it is inevitable. And my argument would be you can't ignore it. It's not just going to go away. And I'd like to talk to you about what happens if you do try to ignore it in relationships. So this is John and Misty. It's not a long story. It'll take me just a couple minutes to read this. And the way I tell stories is I use the word story, but it's not spelled right. It's Storee. So, story. Here is John and Misty's story, and the S stands for what's the situation. And this is a real marriage story. John and Misty were married for 15 years when she came to talk. Oh, by the way, just put that on pause a moment. What I'd like you to listen for is what are the disagreements and what are the tension points in their marriage? That's what I'd like you to listen for. And then I want to show you how we use the pause principle to help people resolve those tension points. So listen for what is causing the tension, what are they disagreeing about in their marriage, okay? You got that? So you're going to hear a whole bunch of stuff, but just keep tuning in for okay, what are the issues? What's causing the tension in this relationship? John and Misty were married for 15 years. When she came to talk, she was miserable. She knew her attitudes about John were wrong, but didn't know what to do. Both John and Misty are former military. In fact, they met in the military. They both grew up in Christian homes, and his father was a pastor. They are the parents of 8 children, and they've homeschooled for years. They live in a less than adequate home for their size family, and John has not had the income to buy a larger home. Just to try to, in counseling, we talk about entering the world of your counselee. So I want you to try to enter their world. They have 8 children, 2 adults, so 10 of them, and their house could fit inside this auditorium 3 times, probably. It's a single story modular, double wide modular home. And so you could probably have 1, 2, 3, and 10 of them are living in that double wide modular home. So I visited them. You can imagine what it looked like on the inside with all the clothes of all those children, etc. So try to enter their world. What's it like? What's the pressure that they're feeling? At church, they portray themselves as the family that has their act together, but at home, there's fighting and even more specifically, a Cold War atmosphere. She sings in the choir and she has a beautiful solo voice. They're very faithful to church and they talk about discipling their children. The kids seem obedient and well mannered. He talks about family worship, and they took their children out of the Awana ministry so that they could spend time discipling their children on Wednesday nights. He's taken another job, which means another move. She's tired of moving and tired of her marriage, and the move is only 4 weeks away. She knows she needs to come and talk. This really presented me with a dilemma. As you're about to hear, this is a mess with the T in story stands for thinking. So you're about to hear what's going on in her thinking and then in her emotions. And they're going to move in 4 weeks. So as a pastor, I'm trying to figure out, okay, what do we do to stabilize this marriage? And we've got 4 weeks to do it. Here's her thinking. That's the T of story. She meditates regularly on beautiful log homes in Southern Living magazine. Now, do you know what Southern Living magazine is? Does that make sense here in California? So beautiful homes that nobody lives in. She also thinks about how much of a loser she married, who can't even provide for their family. She dreams about the day she will be free from this man and makes plans in her mind to get her nursing degree so she can support the children on her own. She dwells on hopeless thoughts many days. She's consumed with bitter thoughts toward her husband, and she calls him a liar and a hypocrite in her mind regularly. He makes so many promises that he doesn't keep and portrays himself to others in ways that aren't true. She is so embarrassed of their house and property, and she also thinks maybe if I keep putting pressure on him, I can get him to change. It's become painfully obvious that this doesn't work. When he finally did come into counseling 2 weeks before they moved, I found out that he dwells on being able to relax, and he does admit to making promises that he has no intention of keeping. When asked what goes through his mind when he knows that he's lying to her, he says, well, quote, I just want her to stop nagging me. Many days as he's driving home from work, he dreams about the movie he's going to watch and the nice big cold glass of Southern sweet tea that he's going to enjoy. He didn't want to come to counseling earlier for fear of what others would think of him. The O of story is others. The kids are obviously impacted, especially with their education. She's feeling so overwhelmed and hopeless, she hardly does any schooling. Their creditors are also impacted, and they're getting letters and phone calls regularly demanding payment. The R of story is how are they responding? He likes to come home and just relax, but that's become next to impossible because she has neglected the house so much. He has to get the kids mobilized to do cleaning. She's so depressed now that she closes herself in her room many days and cries and dreams of being set free. She also has not been paying the bills, and he wasn't paying the bills as well, and their checkbook is a mess. He says he's discipling the kids, but they don't even pray together. He's promised to lead family devotions many times, but he never does. He promises to mow the lawn, but he doesn't do that either. And she's so embarrassed now that their lawn is 12 inches high. Emotions. That's the first of the two E's in story. Depression, anger, fear, and anxiety are all characteristic of her life. The biggest emotion being expressed, though, at the time of counseling was hate. She said, I hate his guts, and I can't wait to be free from him. That's an exact quote of what she said to me when we met. The main emotion he's feeling is fear. Fear of what others will think when they find out what truly is happening in their home. He's also angry at all her nagging. Expectations, that's the last E. She expects him to find a job that provides enough of an income that they can have a bigger home, and it would be really great if it was like one in the magazine. She expects him to be the spiritual leader, and she lets him know it. She wants him to do what he promises, especially keeping the yard neater and the house repaired. He just wants peace and quiet. He wants to be able to relax. He doesn't want people to find out what's happening. So let's think about this. First of all, I'd like to get some feedback from you. So I'm not just going to stand up here and lecture. You gotta help me out here. What happens in relationships if people do not have a procedure for working through issues? So I've already established, and I think you agree with me, that everybody has issues. So we're all dysfunctional. We all live in a Genesis 3 world. We all have a sin nature that we're struggling with. We all have wrong wants and desires. And that's just the reality. I quoted this yesterday. One of my favorite theologians is a man named George Zemek, and he says we're all living with a Genesis 3 hangover. And I feel it every day. I have the Genesis 3 hangover, and you do too. So, what happens if we just ignore problems and if people don't have a procedure for walking through inevitable issues? So, just give me some feedback. Yes. Okay. So it snowballs, just in case you can't hear that, snowballs, and then resentment can happen, and bitterness and separation. And if not physical separation, at least like emotional, like physical separation, as in somebody leaves the house, emotional and even physical separation within the house can happen. What other thoughts do you have? Yes. So cultivating bitterness, which is a horrible way to live life. Life is way too short to live bitter. You got to learn how to forgive. And so it cultivates bitterness and isolation. That was the other thing that you said. What else? What happens if you don't have a procedure? And I see a lot of young people here, by the way, and I'm so thankful you're here because this is not just for married people. Be thinking about what you could be working on now before you're even in serious relationships. What are some conflict resolution uh, procedures that you can be learning even as a teenager and be learning to put into practice with your siblings or your parents? And so that when you get married, you already have an idea of what it takes to have healthy relationships. And I wrote a book about that, by the way. It's called Marry Wisely, Marry Well. So, did I see a hand over here? It's going to blow up. Yeah. So, we think if we ignore it, that that's the way to resolve it, but it festers. And one of the things we've been working on in our church, we have a very large church, and I was the pastor of counseling for 8 years there. And, we have thousands of people to take care of in our church. We have 19 pastors. And don't be awed by that. Our senior pastor says, mega church, mega problems. And that's very, very true. Mega church, mega problems. When I see new people come in the church, I don't think, oh, great, a new family. I think, what issues are they bringing with them? That's how counseling pastors think. When people come, I don't know if that's how Graham thinks, but that's how I think. When I see, I'm excited. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm excited to see new families, but I always do think, oh, I wonder what's happening. And many, many times we've had people come to our church, and before they even become members, they're in our counseling center. And so I won't go down that track. So here's what we're trying to do, because we have so many people to take care of. We're trying to get our Sunday school teachers to think about what can we address, and our small group leaders, what can we address now in small group so that things don't fester, and 10 years from now somebody's in the counseling center because it didn't get addressed in the small group. So things do fester. And I could tell you a lot of stories about people coming and saying, well, we told people 15 years ago about this problem and nobody helped us at that point. And here we are 15 years later, and now it's in this bigger mess. So I think you get the point. Everybody has to have a conflict resolution procedure. You just can't go through life pretending that conflict doesn't exist. You can't go through life without trying in some way to work through issues. Now, I can't say to you, here's a chapter and verse in the Bible that teaches a methodology you have to follow. But what you're going to see with this pause principle is this is the teaching of the Bible, especially one passage that we've put together into an agenda to follow called PAUSE, P-A-U-S-E, not P-A-W-S, as much as I like dogs. That's not what we're talking about. It's P-A-U-S-E, and it's an agenda to follow so that by the end of the agenda, you come to agreement and you've worked through issues instead of just ignoring them or the issue continuing to fester. Rose and I have been using this, trying to use this, continuing to try to use this in our marriage for at least 20 years, I would say 25 years. And we first read this in a book called Peacemaking for Families. And we read through that book with our family, which I would highly recommend, especially when our kids got to be teenagers. We read through a book called Peacemaking for Families, and we taught our children the pause principle. You can feel sorry for my children. They grew up not only in a pastor's home, but they grew up in a biblical counselor's home. So we talk to our kids all the time about biblical counseling principles. And I tried to teach them conflict resolution procedures because I did not want them to end up in a counseling office one day. I wanted them to go into marriage already having some good relationship skills. So without any further delay, let's turn to Philippians chapter 2. And we'll start thinking about the pause principle. I'm going to show you two passages of scripture that this is based on. And then I'm just going to teach you the pause principle. And then we're going to practice. If I had more time, we would literally practice. I'd have you practicing with each other as we are sitting here. But we're going to practice as a group. And we're at the very end, we're going to practice as a group. And we're going to help John and Misty resolve some of their issues that they're disagreeing about. Philippians chapter 2 are absolutely beautiful verses. And Paul is concerned about two women in the church. If you're not familiar with this, read chapter 4. And Paul's really concerned about two women in the church that are it seems like they're in conflict with each other, Euodia and Syntyche. And maybe you've heard this before, but some people call her Sin-touchy. And there's nothing like, sorry, ladies, but there's nothing like when two women in the church get in a big fight with each other. It can spread very quickly in a church if they don't know how to resolve it. So there's two women in this church, it seems, that are upset with each other, and it's spreading into the church. And now the great Apostle Paul is addressing it as he's concerned about this beloved church. And he says in Philippians chapter 2, verses 3-5, do nothing from selfish ambition or vainglory. We spent a lot of time in the conference on Friday and Saturday talking about what is selfish ambition and our desires in our hearts and how they feed conflict. But with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Now, here's the heart of the pause principle. Not merely looking out for your own personal interest, it's going to be a really important word, but also for the interests of others. Have this way of thinking in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus. Would you agree with this statement theologically? Jesus had our best interest in mind. Did I just speak heresy? So he's about to write that Jesus did not think equality with God is a thing he had to frantically hold on to. He had to grasp it. But Jesus left the throne room of heaven and became a human, and he went down, 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 down to the point of dying on the cross. That's the progress in Philippians chapter 2. He had your best interest in mind. He did not have his best interest in mind. Do you agree with that statement? He had your best interest in mind, so he was a servant. Now think what that would do in marriages when we're in conflict, that we would think, okay, I want to have my spouse's best interest in mind, not I'm waiting for them to stop talking so I can convince them that my opinion's right. It's just the opposite. It's, honey, I really want to hear your opinion. Now, that implies a lot of things. That implies that it's safe for your spouse to talk, or it's safe for the other person to talk. And in marriage counseling, I tell couples regularly, if it is not safe to bring up any subject in your marriage, that's the very first thing you need to talk about. Why isn't it safe to bring up a subject? Maybe you need to go home today and ask the question of each other, is it safe to talk about anything? Remember, husbands and wives are supposed to be one flesh. That's the end of Genesis chapter 2. They were at the end of Genesis 2. I used to get so embarrassed reading this verse. Why is that in the Bible? They were naked and not ashamed. Genesis 2:24. Why did God think that was important to put in the Bible? They were naked and not ashamed. Well, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, they're now naked and ashamed. They started covering up. As soon as sin entered the world, something happened to their marriage. Just 7 verses earlier, they're naked and not ashamed. There is nothing between them, not even clothes. There's nothing off limits, no shame. They could talk about anything. No guilt, no shame, no fear. Now sin enters the world, and there's guilt, fear, shame. There's barriers in marriage. So I think couples need to talk about why isn't it safe to talk about that, whatever that taboo subject is in your home or taboo subjects, talk about that. of why doesn't it feel safe? And what are we going to do about that so that we can make it a safer environment so that we can talk about any subject? Because then you can practice the pause principle of what are the interests of your spouse and look not out to your own interests, but also the interests of others. Now, let's contrast this with the secular world. The secular world does what we call competitive negotiating. Do you know what competitive negotiating is? Maybe some of you have experienced it and you've been to court and somebody hired a lawyer against you. Competitive negotiating is I am hiring the best lawyer I can to beat you. I am trying to beat you. I'm going to out argue you. I'm going to outspend you because I need to win. Competitive negotiating. Biblically, we want to do cooperative negotiating. Everybody has to learn how to negotiate in life. If you don't learn how to negotiate with other humans, especially your spouse, you're going to be miserable. You have to learn a way to negotiate with people. And you can negotiate without compromising your principles. It's look not out to your own interests, but the interests of others. So cooperative negotiating, not competitive negotiating. How do I serve this person? Here's another phrase. How do we come to mutually satisfying solutions? It's not about someone wins and someone loses. I want to look out for the interests of my wife. She wants to look out for my interests. We'll talk in more detail about how you get at the interests of someone in a moment. And then I hear her concerns, she hears my concerns. Now, how do we come to a mutually satisfying agreement once we really understand each other's concerns? So far, what are we hearing? Uh, Competitive? No. We want cooperative negotiating. We want to be able to talk about any issue because we are called to be one flesh in marriage. There shouldn't be topics that are off limits. So maybe we need to start with talking about uh, why is this subject off limits? Why does it not feel safe to talk about this subject? John and Misty have a lot to talk about. Let's just throw out a couple of ideas. What did you hear as issues with John and Misty? And while we're talking about this, turn to Matthew 22. So, what did you hear as issues? What are they fighting about? What are the tension points in their marriage? Money is an issue, and not enough of it. Okay, so there's something there about I'm tired of moving and repeated relocation. What did I hear over here? Responsibilities. So, neglecting responsibilities. She's neglecting responsibilities, right? And he's neglecting responsibilities. What else are you hearing that are tension points? Promises not being kept. Yes. And it's even worse than that. He's purposely lying to her. She's nagging him, and he's purposely lying to her. I just want her to stop nagging me. So disrespectful thoughts and words toward one another. Yes, very much so, especially on Misty's part. So unrealistic expectations. Yeah, like the house. And are you hearing discontentment? There's some discontentment issues. So are there a lot of counseling issues here? Yeah, there's a boatload of counseling issues here. And I'll just tell you now, they're still happily married. This is a success story. God was so gracious. And it was a miracle that happened in 4 weeks. And she responded so well to counseling, just miraculously. She responded well to counseling. And she went home and asked him for forgiveness for the way that she was nagging her husband. She started realizing that she had a control tendency going on in her heart. And she repented of that. And he came to me. He was reluctant to come for counseling. And he came to me and he said, this is literal words that John said to me. I don't know what's going on with her, but I want some of it. And he came to counseling. then. And in 4 weeks, God just did a miracle and stabilized their marriage. And that was a long, long time ago now. And we actually just got to see, we didn't see them, but we saw some of their children at a church where I spoke in another state recently, and they're happily married. And so listen to Matthew 22, and then I'm going to go through what does pause stand for. These are the two great commandments. They're trying to trick Jesus, the religious leaders, and they say to him in verse 36, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment." Just a quick commentary about this. Don't picture these as love God, love others. You can't have it that way. You can't have you can't have others at the same level as loving God, because that would be idolatry. So it can't be that. It has to be love God, love others, and I love others out of my relationship with the Lord. So this is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets. You know what he's saying? That is New Testament terminology for the whole Old Testament. That's an incredible statement that Jesus just said there. The whole Old Testament hangs on these two commandments: love God and love others. So, if we're going to have a conflict resolution procedure, it ought to involve this attitude of love. How do I put others above myself? And how do I do conflict as an act of worship out of love for the Lord? And we talked about that Friday night. How do we glorify God in the midst of conflict? So these two commandments hang the whole law and the prophets, and loving God and loving others. Now, what is the pause principle? Let me fill in the blanks for you. The P stands for prepare. Prepare for conversations. And I'm going to go into more details about what each one of these means. So I'll unpack each one in a little bit. Affirm relationships is the A. You already have heard what the U is. Understand interests. And we need to, I'll slow down when I get there because I want to unpack that and how you do it. Then search for creative solutions. And then evaluate options objectively and reasonably. Let me go through it again. Prepare, affirm, understand, search, and evaluate. Really simple. And it's a process that you and your spouse, or you and the other person that you're trying to work through a disagreement with, can agree and just say, okay, we're going to follow the pause principle and try to work through this disagreement with each other. But what do you do to prepare? I've already talked about the atmosphere and answering the question, is it safe to talk? And if it's not, ask yourself the question, why isn't it safe to talk? You obviously want to pray about your own heart, pray for the other person that you're going to go talk to. We talked about in our 4 G's of conflict resolution on Saturday morning, we talked about get the log out of your own eye first. Is there something I've contributed to this conflict and something I need to do to make things right? Then what are the issues that are causing disagreement between us? And write them down. Now, the other person, when you finally get to talk to them, they may not agree with the way you state the issues, but that's fine, because you want to hear their concerns and how they would state the issue, because we are interested in mutually satisfying solutions, not I'm going to impose my solution on you necessarily. Sometimes that has to happen when there's in roles like in authority and things. There has to be an agreement that, okay, I get to make the final decision, but I really would like to avoid that as much as possible. Study the Bible. What does the Bible say about this issue? Maybe seek other counsel. What are other people? What would they tell you about this issue? How might the other person react or respond? So anticipate their reactions. Pick a good time and place. I like to pick a neutral location. I don't want, I want everybody to feel comfortable in the conversation. So how do we pick a neutral place where everybody feels comfortable talking about the issue? And then what are you going to say to start? And that goes right into the next one. You can start off positive, affirm the relationship. Tell people what you tell your spouse, honey, this is not about divorce. There's something that's disturbing our marriage, and I'd like to talk about this issue, but I am totally committed to you and I love you. And I would just say to you that in your marriage, if you use the divorce word as a threat, you need to repent of that. That is just, I'm a counselor. I've been doing marriage counseling for over 4 decades. I've spent thousands of hours doing marriage counseling, and I would just say to you, stop that. Just, you don't like me, divorce me. You don't like me, just leave. And people throw out that type of thing, uh, and it just sets up a nasty atmosphere in a home. Instead, affirm the relationship. I am totally committed to you. I think we can work through this, but we do have something we have to talk about. But I love you. And here's 5 things I love about you. We have one thing that's bothering us, but here's 5 things I love about you. Let me give you a quick story. We were doing a building program as a church. This was a church I pastored in Virginia. And as you may know, building programs can cause problems in churches. And we had it was at that time, it was almost $1 million building program. It would be so much more now. And we had one man promise $40,000 to the building program, which was, praise God. I didn't know who he was, but we got all the money together and we had a groundbreaking ceremony, even had the mayor of the town there, and we had this incredible groundbreaking service. It was just a wonderful time. And then 2 weeks later, the church treasurer came to me and he said, we have a problem. A person who promised $40,000 has now said he will not give the money unless we promise to never change the worship style of the church, which was conservative. And I won't go into all the details of what was going on. You heard some of the backstory of that if you were at the conflict resolution conference. So there's a lot going on at our church related to that. So I had to find out who he was and go talk to him because it seemed logical he was using his money to manipulate the church. It was very concerning. And the church board was very upset. And then I reminded our church board of the pause principle because as a desperate pastor, I had taught the whole congregation conflict resolution procedures. And I said, okay, guys, this is a perfect opportunity for us to practice the pause principle. And we picked the 3 deacons from our church who he could hear the best. Some of the men on the church board he did not have good relationships with, so we did not want them in the room. So I went, and 3 of the men from our church board who had the best relationships with him, we met. And I started off not by going right for the jugular of how dare you use your money to manipulate the church. That's not how we started the meeting. We started the meeting by thanking him for being an Awana leader for 20 years, and we thanked him for being a 5th grade boys Sunday school teacher for 15 years. And I meant it sincerely. I was not trying to manipulate him in any way. I was very, very thankful. The Lord helped me get my attitude right toward him before we even went into the meeting. So affirm relationships. That sets a different tone. Rather than an antagonistic tone, you're starting off with reassuring the person and you're taking some of the pressure out of the room by reassuring them of your commitment to them. Now, we're right in the middle of pause now. What's the next step? Understand each other's interests. This means you're going to have to listen really well and ask good questions. And a lot of people have no idea how to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you listen well and how you ask other people questions. Let me fill in the blanks first. And I'm going to explain by using my hands. I'm going to draw a diagram up here by using my hands of what each one of these blanks represents. So we're going to start up here at the top in the center, and that's going to be the issue. So that's the first blank. What's the issue? And you're turning the issue into a question that needs to be answered. And I'm going to give you a bunch of illustrations here so you know what I mean and why you have to turn it into a question to be answered. So, what is the issue? Well, we've already determined with John and Misty, there's a bunch of issues like what are we going to do? Notice what I'm doing. I'm turning it into a question. What are we going to do about our house? So they know they have an issue. They disagree about the house and what to do about the house. What in the world are we going to do about the house? A lot of times we often take an issue and we just naturally ask a question. What are we going to do about this? In our church, where we were fighting about music and music style and contemporary Christian music and whether, is it right or wrong to have drums on the platform? Is it right or wrong to use guitars in worship? Notice what I'm doing. I'm taking an issue, I'm turning it into a question. That's important because the next step in pause is let's start searching for solutions. Let's not be antagonistic with each other anymore. We're a team. We're not going to allow this issue to divide us. Let's brainstorm answers together of how to get answers to this question that we're asking. I'll get to that more in a moment, and I'm going to give you some more tangible illustrations. So, an issue that's up here, it's right in the center. And then the next line is your desired outcome. That's your position. John has a position on the issue of the house. Misty has a position. That's why we fight. We have different positions on the issue. Are you tracking with me? So there's an issue, and people take different positions on the issues. Are piano and organ the only instruments that should be used in worship, or are guitars and drums legitimate? We had an issue in our church. We had different positions on the issue. Most often, people fight about their positions and they try to convince the other person that their position is right. And they don't understand it would be much more strategic if you go down to the next level. What are your interests? Someone's interests, that's what Paul says, look not out for your own interests, but the interests of others. What motivates someone to take the position that they do? Let me tell you some stories. So when I started asking this man, I told him our fear, and he said, I get it. I just, after affirming the relationship, telling him we love him and respect him, I said, our concern is you're using your money to control the church. And he said, I totally get that. And I understand why you would take that, why you would have that understanding, but that's not my heart. It's just my conscience is bothering me. And by the way, his wife was the organist. So if you've been involved in these conflicts, I just told you some very interesting data. So his wife was the organist, so I can imagine what their conversations were like going on at home. Nothing wrong with organ. I love good organ music, but we definitely had, they called it the sacred music style. And it was only the piano and organ that were the allowed instruments that some people believed in the church. So I asked him, what's your fear? That's a really important question. I'm trying to get at his interests. What's your fear? And dots started to connect for me as a pastor because I had been asking other people in the church, what's your fear about guitars? What's your fear about drums? And I started hearing a common theme. Their fear was doctrinal compromise. Well, I didn't say, well, that's just wrong. They knew I believed that, but I didn't want to be antagonistic. I said, well, why do you believe that? Why is that your fear? Why is that your concern? And he started to unpack how shallow, at that time, how shallow he thought some contemporary Christian music was doctrinally and theologically. And I said, oh, I get that. I can understand that, but I can assure you I'm not interested in doctrinal compromise at all as a pastor. In fact, I want to strengthen our church doctrinal statement. I don't want to weaken our church doctrinal statement. So, what is the fear? Ask your spouse if you feel tension in your marriage, you know what the issue is. Okay, honey, what's the question that needs to be answered about this thing that we disagree about? turn it into a question or maybe two questions. These two questions need to be answered. Help me understand your fear, why you're taking the position that you do on this issue. Let me give you another illustration. I had a couple come to me, a very intelligent couple for marriage counseling. He was a seminary graduate. She was a very theologically trained woman as well, and very astute theologically, both really good thinkers. But they had a number of issues in their marriage. They had 6 children, and their house was always a mess. And so the issue was the cleanliness of our house. Now, I'm going to turn it into a question. How clean does our house need to be? And I know nobody else has ever had that issue, right? So, how clean does our house need to be? His position, this is literally his words. So, two positions. His position was chill out, baby. Just relax. You're way too uptight about this. Her position was, this is driving me insane. I cannot function this way. Our house is always a mess, and you don't care. You don't get the kids organized to get the house clean. So they know what the issue is. How clean does the house need to be? They have different positions, and for 15 years, they could not come to an agreement on this, and now they're in marriage counseling. It had festered to the point of, we just can't keep going on about this. She's saying, I'm going to go insane. So I had them doing reading about the pause principle and how do you use the pause principle. And in counseling, I had them start practicing it. Well, he didn't even know. He was so relationally inept. He's a seminary graduate, but he didn't even know how to ask his wife questions. He didn't even know how to be relational with her. So I thought, okay, I'll model it for you. So I turned to her and I said, what's your fear? And as soon as I said that, it's like buckets of water started coming out of her eyes. And she just was profusely crying. And she started telling a story. When I was 12 years old, I ran away from home because the house I grew up in, was chaos all the time. And when I was 15 years old, I was raped. And I just heard our daughter say recently, who's about to turn 18, I can't wait to get out of this house because our house is always a mess. And I'm afraid that our daughter is going to make the same mistakes that I made. But he had known that she had been abused when she was 15, but he had never put the pieces together of why this issue was so important to her. And I looked over at him, and his look on his face was like all these dots were connecting in his mind of why his wife was so concerned about this issue. Now, do you think that he got more cooperative? He got a whole lot more cooperative, and he said, "Oh, honey, I get it. I'll come up with a plan." So after 15 years of impasse, if they would have just worked on what's the fear, what's the concern, now let's find mutually satisfying solutions. Instead of fighting about the positions that we're taking on the issue, let's get at each other's fears and concerns and find mutually satisfying solutions, because you're supposed to have a one flesh relationship. And I could tell you a lot of different stories about how that's helped, um, actually hundreds and hundreds of couples. I teach this to every couple, and every time I do a mediation, if I do a church mediation, family mediation, marriage mediation, everybody learns the pause principle, and I make them practice it in counseling, because I'm absolutely convinced every human being needs a conflict resolution procedure, because we live with inevitable conflicts with people, and if you don't resolve them, they just fester. And I don't want my relationship with my wife to fester, or my children, or people in church. I want to bring everything to resolution. Now, what you have in the rest of the notes then is almost step-by-step procedures of the types of questions to ask each other. Ask each other, so I have next, what's your fear? And it seems like your fear is, make sure you're getting it right. Repeat back to the person, it seems like your fear is. And then let them correct you if you're not getting it right. And ask each other that question. So repeat back to the person what you believe you're hearing. And then the next thing I have is try to concisely state what the issue is from each other's perspective and narrow it down to a sentence or two. And you want to turn it into a question. What's the question that needs to be answered? You're not the enemy. The issue is the enemy. That's a really important point. I don't want to send the message to my spouse, you're the problem. The issue is the problem. This issue, Satan is using this issue to come between us. And Ephesians chapter 4 says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. And the very next verse says, don't give the devil an opportunity. He would love for this issue to stay between you and your spouse, because every day that you allow it to go unresolved, the first day he gets his toe in the door, and then he gets his foot in the door, and then he gets his ankle in the door, and then he gets his nasty leg in the door, and pretty soon you've Satan, instead of a gospel saturated atmosphere in your home, you have a satanic atmosphere in your home where there's division in your home. So you have to learn how to work through issues. And then after you understand the issue, you understand why your spouse takes the position, you're not the problem, the issue is the problem. Let's start brainstorming solutions. Now there's a rule to follow when you brainstorm solutions. You don't criticize each other's ideas. You tell me what happens if we know what the issue is. We know the question that needs to be answered. Now let's brainstorm some solutions, and you start throwing out, well, what if we did this? And your spouse goes, no, that wouldn't work. What just happened? You just shut down the conversation. So when you get to the brainstorming of searching for creative solutions, the rule you follow is no criticizing. I tell people at this point, you're trying to invent, not decide. Invent, 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 invent. Well, what if we did this? What if we did this? The sky's the limit. Just invent. Throw out ideas. What if we did this? What if we did this? What if we did this? And then if things get heated, just take a break, pray together, and then you come back and brainstorm some more. And then you evaluate the options objectively and reasonably. Of all these things we brainstormed, what are we going to do? And let's come to agreement. And you'll be amazed at how you'll go, well, why didn't we think of this before? Well, the reason why you didn't think of it before is because you didn't take time to brainstorm together, or it didn't even feel safe to brainstorm together. What are some creative things that John and Misty could do? Let's just brainstorm a little bit, and no criticizing. So don't criticize each other's ideas right now. What are some things John and Misty could do? And then I'm going to pray. So let's assume they're practicing the pause principle and the house is a big issue. What could they do? Let's just take that one issue, the house. What are we going to do? Honey, we're stuck. We're in this little house and there's 8 of us. So employ the children. Don't criticize. So a cleaning checklist. Maybe we need to get rid of stuff. No criticizing. We're just brainstorming. This is about inventing, not deciding at this point. Yes. Assigning chores. What about the house size? Let's talk about the house size. Yes. Okay, so Lord, help us have more common sense. Yes. Say that again. Look for a bigger home. He had a the issue there was his income, and they were in the home that they could afford. So maybe he needed to, Lord, please help me find a better job. I need to go on a job search. He's a comfort lover, by the way. He did not like, if you picked up on that, watching movies and drinking sweet tea was what he wanted to do. So he did need to get more motivated in taking care of his family. Do you get the idea? This works really well. It's not complicated. Here's the complicated part. We're lazy. That's the complicated part. We don't like to say, okay, I'm going to discipline myself to learn a procedure. But I started off with what are the dangers if you don't learn a procedure? And I'm a marriage counselor, so I'm begging you, learn some type of conflict resolution procedure. If the things that are unresolved right now aren't dealt with, think where your marriage can be 5 or 10 years from now. And I don't want you to end up in that spot. Learn how to work through issues. If you don't like the pause principle, make up your own. Figure out some way to resolve conflict. Just don't let it fester in your marriage. That's so dangerous for relationships and marriages. Let me pray. And then this morning during the worship service, we're going to study Ephesians 4 together. Lord, thank you for this time and for this church that takes you and your word seriously. And I would ask your blessing on the relationships in this room, family relationships, marriages, church relationships, that everyone would grow in astuteness in how to apply biblical principles to their relationships for your glory. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.